Hello friends, welcome back to JK Shah classes. I'm Professor Nihit Jhaveri for AY 2025-26, that is for May 25 and November 25 attempt. We have a revision of this chapter called Tax Treaties. Overview, application and interpretation of tax treaties. This chapter is a part of international taxation which comes separately for 30 marks. This chapter is divided ideally into three parts: overview, that is meaning of tax treaties and all, and application and interpretation. Now this chapter, some part of this chapter is applicable, though the title says tax treaties, it is applicable not only to tax treaties. This chapter or some part of this chapter is applicable to any other treaty also. Like between India and Pakistan, for example, we have a treaty for sharing water of Indus River, which is called Indus Water Treaty, IWT. Such kind of treaty or climate change treaty between multiple countries including USA, whereby USA backed out of it. Okay, so this chapter is not only for tax treaties, but ideally we have to understand this chapter from the perspective of tax treaty. Now basically this chapter is divided into three parts: overview. This chapter is entirely theory chapter. Many people skip this chapter, but I would suggest you some relevant part which I will tell you as important. I will teach you the whole chapter in revision lecture, but then I will tell you what part to be focused upon: overview, application, and the third part is interpretation. What is most important is the interpretation of any treaty. Now let's finish off overview and application very quickly, which is less important or which is totally unimportant. Tax treaty and overview, it's divided into 3 points: definition of tax treaty, types of DTAA, and directive principles set in the Constitution of India. So what is the definition of treaty? So treaty is actually defined not in any act. The problem here is that when there are agreements between two people, residents of India, understand, if there is an agreement, let's say partnership deed between two partners, three partners, then is there any law governing such kind of deed? Answer yes, we have Indian Partnership Act, 1932. Then we have Indian Contract Act 1872. We have certain acts governing 1872. We have certain acts governing the treaties in India at local level. But when the treaty is between two countries, any kind of treaty, ideally tax treaty, but any other treaty, then what will happen with regards to any disputes between two countries? Then how to interpret the treaty, how to apply the treaty, what is the meaning of treaty, is there any international law? So answer, earlier there was no international law governing the treaty. So if there is a dispute between two countries, they used to wage a war, or they used to fight with each other, or they used to cancel the treaty. That is what could at the max happen. There was no solution to that. So earlier the treaties were interpreted as per some customary law or customary principles, which is not a law. Customary principles is like unwritten law. Unwritten law is in something which is not written anywhere, but it is accepted as a law, accepted as a principle. Like for example, if you go to any public place of worship, mosque, temple, church, etc., we ideally remove our footwear outside. But is there any law that if you have to remove your footwear outside only, you cannot go inside with the footwear? Or suppose somebody who smokes, somebody who consumes alcohol, will you consume alcohol inside the public place of worship? Answer no. Is there any prohibition? Have you ever seen any placard or any board or any notice that smoking is not allowed here, or alcohol consumption is not allowed here? Such kind of notices are not there, but it is unwritten law that this is what happens, this is what is supposed to be done, this is what is not supposed to be done. That kind of customary principles were there to interpret the language of the treaty. However, in 1980, there is one country called Austria, European country, Austria, not Australia, Austria, whose capital is Vienna. So there was one agreement between 116 countries called Vienna Convention on Law of Treaties, Vclt, 1980. The work started in 1969, finally concluded in 1980, whereby whatever were the customary principles going on, whatever countries believe, that was converted into a proper law. And this was signed by 116 countries by the year 2018, January 2018. 116 countries have ratified it, that means they have agreed upon it, out of total 196 countries. So whatever were the customary principles were converted into law signed by so and so country. That means these many countries have agreed that whatever we were following, now we will accept it as a law. Prior to VCLT, how we were interpreting, that is what we will be discussing in this particular chapter. There are some internal law, basic rules or basic principles, and there is something called extrinsic material, that is external aid available to interpret the law. There are some 13-14 points which we will be discussing one by one. The starting part, overview and application, are unimportant, but let's quickly finish it off. Overview starts with the definition of treaty. What do you mean by treaty? So treaty is defined. Why I discuss about Vienna Convention of Law of Treaty in between? Because the treaty is not defined anywhere. There is no law applicable except of Vienna Convention on Law of Treaties, VCLT. Though it is written 1969, it is actually 1980. It was started in 1969, finally latest version is of 1980. That's why we should understand it as 1980. Article 2. It says that it defines treaty to mean an international agreement concluded between two states. 5 points are there. Number 1, it's an international agreement concluded between states, maybe two states, maybe multiple states. It is in a written form. 3rd point. 4th point, it is governed by international law. And 5th point is whether it is embodied or it is running into a single instrument or there is a set of multiple related instruments. Ideally, 99.99% cases, there are 2 or more documents or instruments which are attached with each other, and they combined together they form agreement or treaty. Okay, this is the definition, which is not going to come in the exam. So definition is over. Second, 2 types of DTAA. This is interesting. This can come in the form of MCQ. There are 2 types of DTAA which we discussed in DTAA chapter also. Limited DTAA and comprehensive DTAA. What is limited? In limited DTAA, there will be mention only about limited incomes. Ideally passive incomes. Agreement will be between 2 countries only for dividend, interest, royalty, FTS, or at the max capital gain. It is limited to certain incomes. Tax rates will be given only for certain income. However, on the other hand, comprehensive DTAA will cover all incomes. We will talk about each and every income, whatever you can think about. Plus, sometimes comprehensive DTAAs cover, in addition to Income Tax Act, it covers other acts also. It talks about avoidance of other acts also, like Gift Tax Act, Inheritance Tax Act, GST, Municipal Tax, etc. And the third and the last point is, so second point is important, first point is unimportant, definition. Third point is slightly okay, not important also and not unimportant also. So question is, the title is Directive Principles set out in the Constitution of India. Directive principles means those principles which provide direction, which show you the direction, which show us the path. So what is it? So first of all, it's divided into 2 parts. First part, who enters into DTAA? The answer, we say DTAA is, or any treaty is entered into between 2 countries. Let's say one is India, other is Mauritius. So in India, who enters into the treaty? Who signs the treaty on behalf of India? Some human being has to sign, no? So answer, it is Finance Minister. So Finance Minister, who has given authority to Finance Minister? The answer, authority comes from the parent law, that is Constitution of India. Finance Minister is given authority by section 90 and 90A of the Income Tax Act, and section 90A of Income Tax Act derives this authority coming from or flowing from Constitution of India, which is the parent law. After the Constitution is over, there are 14 schedules. Out of 14 schedules, Schedule 7 schedule to the Constitution of India, there are 3 lists. First list is Union list, which talk about items or entries on which central government has got exclusive jurisdiction. Second list is of State list, on which state governments will have an exclusive power. And the third list is concurrent list, where state government, central government, both of them will have the power. Out of the 3 lists given in the 7th schedule to the Constitution of India, the first list, Union list, entry number 10 and entry number 14, empower Constitution of India, empowers Parliament to enter into treaties with foreign countries. Now, as per this entry 10 and entry 14, Parliament is empowered, and Parliament has conferred this power to central government under section 90 and 90A of the Income Tax Act. Parliament would include the ruling party as well as opposition party combined together, but the power is ultimately given to ruling party, that is central government, that is ruling party. and ruling party would mean finance minister. Now the second half of this third point talks about directive principles. Directive principles while entering into treaty are governed by Article 51 of the Constitution of India. It lays down some directive principles which must be followed by countries while entering into DTAA between India and the other country. Article 51 simply states 4 points. It states that the states as in countries will have to endeavor means try level best to follow these 4 principles. Number 1, promote international peace and security. Let me remind you once again that these are directive principles. They are optional, in a sense they are suggested by our Constitution of India, that whenever India enters into a treaty with any country, India should take care that so and so purposes are achieved, which are not necessary. It's not necessary that all the 4 purposes have to be achieved. Otherwise, we can never enter into treaty with enemy countries like Pakistan. So, idea is to promote, or the states, that is countries, should try to promote international peace and security. Second, maintain just and honorable relations amongst each other, and foster respect for international law and treaty obligations. And last one is encourage settlement of international disputes by arbitration and not by war. Okay, these are the 4 principles set out. It is optional up to India to follow or not to follow in its entirety. Now the next is application of treaty. Application and interpretation both combined together. It says, as far as interpretation is concerned, these rules, there are some basic principles. These basic principles are required, or basic rules are required, which can be called as a customary principle, are required only when the language used in the treaty, any kind of treaty, is ambiguous or giving rise to 2 different types of interpretation. If the language is very clear, unambiguous, then all these rules are not required. When the language used in a treaty is ambiguous, vague, and gives rise to different meanings, if the words are clear and unambiguous, then no such rules are needed. Some important principles of customary international law are as follows. There are 8 rules which are covered by institute, which we will be discussing here. Whatever is covered by institute in this chapter, you will not find anywhere else. So in case you want to cross verify that where is this given, what is the exact language, you will not be able to cross verify, you will not be able to do the needful, because this chapter is not a part of any law. After all the 8 rules are over, I have mentioned a note also. These rules of interpretation, these are the rules of interpretation and not the rules of law. Therefore, are not applied like the way the rules enacted by legislature are applied. This is whatever we discussing or going to discuss are customary principles. This is generally believed like that. The first one is golden rule, which is also called objective interpretation. Now, what kind of questions are asked by institute? These 8 rules are important, but important as in what sense? Institute will give you match the column. Match the column, left hand side something will be given to you, right hand side something will be given to you, you have to match the column. So, for each and every basic rule out of 8 rules, you will have to observe and analyze and mark down the wordings, the technical words which are used. So, first one is called golden rule. It is also called objective interpretation. So, this can come in the form of MCQ, whereby institute will give you, on left hand side they will give you golden rule, right hand side they will give you somewhere objective interpretation. It says while interpreting any term or a word. Now here we are talking about interpretation of a particular terminology or the word which is used in the treaty, and we are not talking about interpretation of the whole treaty, because same whatever we are discussing here, same rule, exactly same language will come up in upcoming point also. But in upcoming point we will be discussing about the interpretation of the whole treaty, and here we are talking about interpretation of a particular word. It should be interpreted keeping its objective in mind. Why was that word used? What was the objective? And shall we interpret it according to its ordinary and literal meaning? Please underline ordinary and literal meaning. Okay, so institute once asked the question, on one side match the column, one side they gave ordinary and literal meaning, second hand on other side they gave golden rule. The word should be understood according to the plain and natural meaning. Please underline plain and natural meaning also. Okay. Now, if any grammatical interpretation, the literal interpretation results into any absurdity, or is inconsistent with the other part of the treaty, or it goes beyond the intention of the parties, then such interpretation should be avoided. Second is subjective interpretation. Don't go according to the title of the point, because the title sometimes will match and sometimes it will not match with the content. According to subjective interpretation, the terms of the treaty, here again we are going to discuss about interpretation of a particular word or the term. Terms of the treaty are to be interpreted keeping in mind the common intention of the contracting parties at the time of concluding the treaty. So, interpretation of a particular word subject to what was the intention of the parties at the time of concluding the treaty, at the time of signing the treaty. Intention must be ascertained from the words used in the treaty and the context in which such word is used. Mainly context in which such word was used, keeping in mind you interpret the meaning of that word. Purposive interpretation, don't go according to the title. Under this, treaty is to be interpreted so as to facilitate the attainment of the purpose or aims or the objectives of the treaty as a whole. This approach is also called object and purpose method. Please underline object and purpose method. Object and purpose method is to be understood as purposive interpretation and not objective interpretation. The title of the first rule is objective interpretation, but when it says object and purpose method, it does not mean objective principle or objective rule, it would mean this purposive interpretation. This is also called, underline, teleological interpretation. For example, there was this case law before Supreme Court, Union of India versus Azadi Bachao Andolan. So, in Union of India versus Azadi Bachao Andolan, Apex Court, that is Supreme Court, observed that the preamble, the starting point of the agreement of Indo-Mauritius Treaty states that the treaty is for encouragement of mutual trade and investment. So, normally treaties are for what? Treaties are to avoid double taxation, tax treaties. But double taxation avoidance is not always the main purpose. Sometimes other purposes are also to be achieved by the treaty. Another purpose between Indo-Mauritius Treaty, Mauritius is a tax haven country. So, in 1984 when we entered into treaty with Mauritius, Azadi Bachao Andolan, there is one organization which went up to Supreme Court to fight out on this matter, that why India is entering into tax treaty with a tax haven country. What is the purpose? So, now government clarified it from the preamble. Supreme Court also had a look at the preamble stating that encouragement of mutual trade and investment between two countries, that is also the purpose. In other words, avoidance of double taxation was not the only purpose of the treaty. Encouragement of mutual trade and investment between the two countries is also the purpose of the treaty. Principle of effectiveness. This is very straightforward. The title and the contents are matching. It says according to this, treaty should be interpreted in a manner to have effect rather than to make it void. The treaty should be understood in right sense so that the treaty actually becomes effective rather than making it ineffective. Treaty should be given interpretation which on the whole will render the treaty most effective and useful. Next point is principle of contemporanea exposito. Contemporary means the modern view, the latest one. Modern, generally we use this word contemporary with regards to artwork, contemporary art. However, here contemporanea exposito would mean the old meaning, not the modern meaning, not the latest meaning. It says, however, this rule is generally not accepted by most of the countries including India, but one option is that the treaty or the word used in the treaty can be understood having regard to the original meaning at the time of prevailing at the time of entering into treaty. The terms of the treaty, here also we are talking about, here again we are talking about interpretation of the term, interpretation of a particular word. Terms used in a treaty are to be interpreted on the basis of their meaning at the time when the treaty was concluded. However, this principle is not accepted by most of the nations. Even in one of the cases, Authority for Advance Ruling, which is now Board for Advance Ruling, Abdul Razak Memmon's case, in case of Abdul Razak Memon in the year 2005, AAR stated that the treaty is best understood or the statute is best understood by following the construction, following the interpretation put upon it by the judges at the time when the treaty was made or soon thereafter. Not only treaty, any law. Liberal construction, that is liberal meaning. Two types of constructions or interpretations are possible, liberal and the opposite of that is literal sense. For example, if I tell you, if I am angry and if I tell my friend get lost, then that does not mean I want him to completely get lost. It's a way of saying. So, such kind of wordings should not be interpreted in its literal meaning or in its literal sense, should be understood liberally. Okay, if I tell somebody go to hell, that does not mean I really intend to send him to hell if hell exists. This is a generally accepted principle that the treaty shall be liberally be construed. Now we are talking about interpretation of treaty and not the word. treaty should be liberally be construed, liberally be constructed, liberally be understood, liberally be interpreted, so as to carry out the apparent intention of the parties. With a view to give effect to the true intentions of the parties, if a literal or legal interpretation defeats the basic object of the treaty, such interpretation should be avoided. This was slightly important. Institute asked one question based on this. Institute asked, again match the column. They said if it legal interpretation defeats the basic objective of the treaty, such interpretation shall be avoided. On right hand side they gave this, left hand side liberal construction. Okay, here you will have to literally memorize the provisions, you can't do anything. Treaty as a whole. Now this is slightly an important. It says the treaty should be understood, or each paragraph, each sentence, each word of the treaty should be understood having regard to the other part of the treaty also. Treaty should be understood as one whole document. Integrated approach. It should not be read or should not be interpreted in its isolation. So you read only one sentence and you try to interpret, it should not be done that way. It should be subject to other things. Even in the act also, when particular section says that this income is taxable, later on there is a proviso. So you have to read not only the text of the main text of the section, you have to read the proviso also. You have to read it in entirety. You cannot just read one paragraph in isolation and jump to some conclusion. This is applicable for interpreting any law also and interpreting any treaty also. It says integrated approach. So I am highlighting this word, integrated approach. Under this, the treaty should be interpreted as a whole. The entire treaty should be read as a whole and the provision should not be interpreted in isolation. Each word shall be given the same meaning all throughout the treaty. Remember it. You cannot have a different meaning at different places unless the context otherwise requires, unless it is clarified that here the meaning should be this way. For example, we are discussing one word called application. In a chapter called charitable trust, assessment of charitable trust, the word application was used at two different places in two different ways. One was making application. Application used to mean making application in a particular form, in a prescribed form. You know, making application in form number 10, 10A, etc. And second, application used to be understood from the perspective of spending money, application of 85% of income. For charitable trust chapter, spending 85%. 85 here, application would mean spending, and here application would mean applying. So when the same word is used twice in the same chapter or in the same treaty, then it has to be understood having regard to that should be avoided while entering into treaty. And same thing should be avoided by our government also while making the law. So number of years back, when this charitable trust chapter was introduced, number of years back, at that time government should have taken care. Reasonableness and consistency. Consistency will also have the same meaning. The same meaning should be there all throughout the treaty. Consistently there should not be any irregularity. Some part of the treaty, the word means the particular word has a different meaning, other part of the treaty that word has a different meaning. That should not happen, and it should have a reasonable meaning. Under this, each word or phrase should be given a reasonable meaning which is consistent with the other part of the treaty. Note, we have already studied. Now what did we study? We are under the title application and interpretation of treaty. First title was overview of the treaty. Second part is application and interpretation combined together. In that we finished first point, basic rules or basic principles of interpreting the treaty. There were 8 basic rules on which our institute, beloved institute, asked MCQs. MCQs in the form of match the column. Okay, now the second part is external rules or external aids, or we can call it as extrinsic aids to interpret the treaty. It says various extrinsic materials are available. First, there are 5 or 6 available, or 5 or 6 are covered by institute. A, B, C, D, E, F, 6 are covered. So it says provisions of parallel treaty. It says there are 2 parallel treaties similar to each other. For example, there is one treaty between India and Australia, and exactly same kind of treaty is there between Australia and UK. Australia and UK. Now this treaty is more elaborative, more detailed or more elaborated. Both the treaties are parallel to each other. That means they are on the same lines. Both of them are based on OECD version. However, this is less detailed or less elaborated. Then in such situation, the provisions of this treaty can be used for interpreting this particular treaty, which is less elaborative. However, this principle is not acceptable to most of the countries. Most of the countries feel that if same provisions were to be incorporated here, then why is this treaty less elaborative? Why the same provisions are not included here? Why each and every word is not incorporated here? This treaty runs into 23 pages, this treaty runs into 5 pages on the same line. Then why not this treaty also running into 23 pages? Why exactly same provisions are not incorporated? Maybe intention of the parties was to cover only this much. That's why only this much is covered. Therefore, extra 18 pages in this treaty should not be applied forcibly. That's what most countries think. Say provisions of two treaties are the same. Provisions of the two treaties are the same, but one of them is more detailed or elaborated. Then the interpretation or explanation provided in the more elaborative treaty can be applied for the interpretation of the other treaty, which is less elaborative. However, this is not always an acceptable principle for reasons I already explained to you. Second is international articles, essays or reports. They are used widely as an external aid. Articles contributed by renowned people, some people who are popular authors. Like in India, for taxation purpose, we have Sampat Iyengar, we have Vinod Singhania, Dr. Vinod Singhania, Dr. Vinod Gupta, such kind of people whose opinions matter. They are like brilliant people who have done lot of research in the field and have studied all the case laws, all circulars, everything, and are ready. They have studied circulars even prior to 1961 Income Tax Act. They have studied circulars and act of earlier years also of 1932 Income Tax Act. Then those people are in a position to give opinion or write articles. Then articles can be considered as an external aid for interpretation. Article is nothing but opinion of particular person who has authored that article, a written essay. Next is KERs. KERs basically means workbook. KER they draw it is a publication, annual publication, or it's a report published by International Fiscal Association, IFA, International Fiscal Association. Fiscal means financial. It is headquartered at Netherlands and it publishes one report every year which is called KERs de Droit. KERs de Droit Fiscal, KERs de Droit Fiscal International. Now this article or this report addresses to two matters or two topics every year, deals with two major topics each year, and here they pick up some matter. On that matter they do lot of R&D research and they publish the articles. So this is also used widely by various international countries or various courts of international level. KERs were used by Supreme Court of India in case of Azadi Bachao Andolan. Protocol and preamble are very important. What is protocol? Protocol is actually nothing but annexure to the treaty. Okay, here they call it as protocol. The word protocol, the dictionary meaning has a different meaning. Dictionary will have a different meaning, but here it is used in a different sense. World over, each and every DTAA, the starting part of the DTAA is called preamble, then the main text of the treaty, and after the treaty is over, instead of calling it as schedules or annexures, they call it as protocol. Preamble, main text of the treaty, thereafter protocol. So protocol are an integral part of the treaty. It's like an annexure and it's considered to be part of the treaty. It is not considered separately. It's not considered as a separate document. It's just that a title is given. Like Income Tax Act, after the act is over, there are 14 schedules. So those 14 schedules are considered to be part of the Income Tax Act only. They are not to be dealt with separately. And it has the same binding force as the main clauses of the treaty. On this, questions have come twice. One descriptive question of 3 marks and once MCQ came. Same binding force as the main clause. Match the column. The answer, protocol. Protocol is like a supplement to the treaty. Protocol is annexed to the treaty at the end of the treaty to clarify the meaning of certain points. Like for example, Indo-US treaty uses the phrase make available. In India-USA treaty, there is some phrase called make available with regards to fees for technical service, which is clarified in the protocol at the end of the treaty. Protocol must be referred to before jumping to any conclusion. Preamble, again a very important. Preamble is also a part of the treaty. It is given at the beginning. It is the preliminary statement or introduction to the treaty, and preamble contains the purpose of the treaty, why the treaty was entered into, which is found at the beginning of the treaty, which generally contains the purpose of the treaty. On this, question has not yet come, but I suppose or somewhere in my in my heart I feel some positive beats, that question is likely to be asked on this point in any of the upcoming attempt. Preamble could help in interpreting the treaty. For example, same example, Union of India versus Azadi Bachao Andolan. When we entered into, that is India entered into a treaty with tax haven country Mauritius, so they filed a case against government. They went up to Supreme Court to fight out on this matter as to why India is entering into a treaty with a tax haven country. Why is so much of need? So apex court, that is Supreme Court, referred to the preamble of the treaty. Apart from referring to KERs, Azadi Bachao Andolan, there also we discussed KERs were also referred to by Supreme Court. Supreme Court referred to preamble of the treaty and the whole treaty also. Supreme Court, it's a Supreme Court, so they have to refer to multiple materials. Apex Court observed that the preamble of Indo-Mauritius Treaty states that the treaty is for encouragement of mutual trade and mutual investment. In other words, avoidance of double taxation was not the only purpose of this treaty. Encouragement of mutual trade and investment between the two countries was also one of the purpose of the treaty. Okay, and the last one is the most important one in real life, but from exam perspective just important. MAP, M-A-P, Mutual Agreement Procedure. What is MAP? We are already done with in Model Tax Convention chapter. Mutual Agreement Procedure. So the conclusion arrived at, or the resolution of the dispute, the resolution arrived at by mutual agreement procedure is considered as the most authentic external aid. It is by way of bilateral negotiations between the two states by the competent authorities of two contracting states. It is considered as the most authentic external aid as compared to any other external aid. Why? For a simple reason, it has participation of both the parties, signed by both the parties, has a participation of both the parties. It is something which is resolved by both the parties mutually agreeing upon to it. Same simple language, they have a participation of both the party, equal participation. Therefore, it is considered as the most authentic external material. In my opinion, it should not be regarded as an external material. It should be regarded as all the three, MAP, preamble and protocol are the part and parcel of the agreement. They should be regarded as internal material. However, they are called as external by our beloved institute. Next one is commentary. Commentary on OECD and UN model and their importance. What is commentary? Commentary is nothing but explanations or comments or opinions. Commentary is comments. Not the cricket commentary, not that way. Commentary is basically opinions of different people. Now internationally, there are two bodies which provide their commentary. One is OECD, one is UN. So these two people have their model tax convention also, OECD MTC, and now we will have OECD commentary also, which is prepared by OECD only. And on the other hand, we will have model tax convention by UN and we will have also commentaries by UN. India generally follows UN model tax convention. UN model convention is between developing country and the developed country. And OECD model convention is ideally between members of OECD who are all developed countries. So these are the commentary. Like for example, as far as Income Tax Act is concerned, our Income Tax Act 1961, as of today Income Tax Act is applicable. God knows what will be applicable in future. Maybe it may be replaced by Direct Tax Code, but for the time being it is Income Tax Act, which runs into 1800 pages, including some deleted provisions also. Now on this 1800 pages, there is some commentary available by one famous person. I don't know whether you have heard the name or not. Commentary by Sampat and Iyengar or Sampat Iyengar. Sampat Iyengar commentary runs into 18,000 pages and it cost around 15,000 rupees. I don't know the latest price. Few years back it was for 15,000 rupees. I have not referred to it entirely, but imagine for each page of the act there are 10 pages of explanation or commentary. Why was this provision introduced? What was it prior to that? When was it introduced? Why was it introduced? What was going on at that time in the country? How people were taking undue advantage? What was the government's intention to plug that loophole? What was it? So 18,000 pages. Same way internationally there are two commentaries available. One is published by OECD, another is published by United Nations. Now OECD model convention was a primary. In the world, they were the first people to introduce model tax convention or the idea of DTAA between two countries. UN followed it later after number of years. So UN Model Convention is basically copy pasted and modified. It's a copy pasted from OECD Model Convention. Since UN Model Convention is based on OECD Model Convention, therefore UN commentaries are also based on OECD commentaries. So those who are following UN Model Convention, whether after modifying or maybe without making changes, those countries which are following UN Model Convention, they can follow either UN commentary or they can follow OECD commentary, because both are not mutually exclusive. It's not that you can't, if you're following this, you can't follow the other one. It's not like that. This is not any religion that if you are following this religion, you can't follow other religion. Here, this is both the things can be followed by those who have adopted UN Model Convention. Those who are following OECD Model Convention in its entirety without making changes and are members of OECD, then they have to compulsorily follow OECD commentary only. OECD commentary will be automatically be applicable to those countries which are following OECD Model Convention and are the members of OECD. There are 36 members of OECD. Other countries are like India are yet not become member. Membership is not yet been granted. India is just an observer. Okay, so coming back here. So commentary means opinions, explanations, comments. Commentaries by recognized bodies like OECD and UN are of the great importance for the purpose of interpreting the treaty. Since there are two commentaries available in the market, OECD, UN. UN commentary is by and large based on OECD commentary, because UN Model Convention is based on OECD Model Convention. So UN commentaries are also based on OECD commentary. Views expressed in these commentaries carry a great authority. OECD commentaries are generally followed when the treaty is between those countries which are members of OECD, whereas UN commentary, they are followed by those who are when the treaty is between developed country and a developing country like India. Since UN Model Convention is largely based on OECD Model Convention, therefore OECD commentaries can be used by those for interpreting those treaties which are based on UN Model Convention. Those who are following UN model, they can follow UN commentaries as well as OECD commentaries interchangeably. They are not mutually exclusive. In other words, OECD commentaries and UN commentaries are not mutually exclusive. Next is foreign courts decision. So in India, we have states. 28 states are there: Gujarat, Maharashtra, Punjab, Haryana, Tamil Nadu, Karnataka, Kerala. So decision rendered by one high court is not binding in the other high court in the other state, but other state people can use it as an external aid, as a reference. Gujarat High Court decision can be used in Maharashtra. Maharashtra High Court, that is Bombay High Court decision, can be used in Karnataka for reference purpose. Same way, internationally, decision taken by one Supreme Court of one country, say Germany Supreme Court has taken some decision, that can be used in the other countries for reference, not binding but for reference. The judgments rendered by the courts of other countries would also be of a very great amount of relevance. Such judgments are viewed as an international adoption, and to maintain the uniformity of the same, other countries also follow the same while interpreting the treaty. This gives rise to new era of international law. New era of international law, that means foreign courts decision. Question can come in the form of match the column. You don't know, our institute, they have such kind of questions only, which we become totally helpless. Okay, next is very interesting concept: ambulatory approach versus static approach. Static means lacking movement, rigid attitude, not making any kind of changes. This means this only, lifetime, no changes. And ambulatory approach is a very dynamic approach, which is ever changing approach, meaning thereby if somebody is following static approach, then he will interpret the language of the treaty for a 1984 agreement even in 2025 also. Same interpretation which was followed in 1984, same thing will continue as of today also. For example, in the treaty, somewhere they have used the word telecommunication channel. Telecommunication channel. Then 1984, when the agreement was entered into, telecommunication channel used to mean telephone, landline, or at the max fax or telex. Fax or telex. But in 2025, it would include mobile also, and social media also, and email also, and internet also, and God knows what other things. Okay, so in such situation, whether modern meaning should be adopted Like for example, two countries as per Article 26 of Model Tax Convention, they have agreed to exchange information with each other. Exchange of information. So for exchange of information, what should be the mode of exchange? The mode of exchange is mentioned as telecommunication channel. So if one country wants to exchange with the other country some tax related information, can they send it by email or they have to send it by fax only? Whatever was the meaning of telecommunication channel in 1984, you continue with the same meaning as of today also, you have a rigid attitude, then it is called static approach. Static means lacking movement, never changing. And dynamic approach, which is called ambulatory approach, that means ever changing. Static and ambulatory, according to static approach, meaning assigned at the time when the treaty was signed would be followed lifetime. Static means lacking movement. In other words, its old original meaning would be adopted in today's scenario also. No changes will be made considering the developments taking place. It exhibits rigid approach. Remember this, rigid approach is static approach. An ambulatory approach is called dynamic approach. Match the column. According to ambulatory approach, latest meaning at the time of application of treaty, when you are applying the treaty, would apply. This is the dynamic approach. Most countries follow dynamic approach, and India in the treaty, to indicate or to exhibit its dynamic approach, ambulatory approach, India uses the term, India-Australia treaty uses the term from time to time in force. Using such wording from time to time in force indicates ambulatory approach. But ambulatory approach, next point, should be subject to contextual interpretation. Contextual interpretation means it should not so happen that while following ambulatory approach the meaning entirely gets distorted. You come out with some different interpretation, that should not so happen. Like for example, while following this dynamic approach of the meaning telecommunication channel, it should not so happen that telecommunication channel would include Instagram also, that is IG, Facebook. That should not happen. A telecommunication channel would not mean exchanging documents through Facebook, not making it openly available. At the max, email is fine, but then Facebook is not fine, Insta is not fine, WhatsApp, Telegram, that is not acceptable. Okay, so ambulatory approach subject to contextual interpretation. So in other words, while adopting ambulatory approach, meaning should be assigned in such a way that such meaning is consistent in the context in which it is used. So in what context telecommunication channel word was used in our example? In our example, it was used for exchanging information. So email is fine, but then exchanging it through WhatsApp, which can be deleted, which can be manipulated, which can be modified, that should not so happen. If the meaning under ambulatory approach does not match up with the meaning which is required as per context in which it is used, such meaning or interpretation should be avoided. In simple words, meaning under ambulatory approach shall be adopted subject to its overall contextual interpretation. If the context requires the word or phrase to be interpreted otherwise, then meaning should be assigned accordingly and not as per the ambulatory approach. Now the ultimate part of the chapter, interpretation and application, that's what we are discussing. So we discussed that chapter is divided into three parts: overview, application and interpretation. Our institute has kept overview separately, which is unimportant. 3 points, 1 to 3 we are done with, and application and interpretation are combined together, whereby only for namesake the word application is used in the title. Everything talked about in this chapter is about interpretation of tax treaties. The interpretation is divided into three parts. Part 1 was 8 basic principles, 8 basic rules, 6 external aids, and now Vienna Convention on Law of Treaty, Vclt 1980. This part we are done with, and we are done with some extra point. This is important, and last is Vclt. Up till now our institute has not asked any question on Vclt, but I suppose it is slightly important. Vclt was the Vienna Convention on Law of Treaty. Vienna is a capital of a country called Austria. Austria, where Hitler was born, that country exactly. Austria, capital is Vienna. It's a European country, rich country, very small tiny country, very beautiful place to live, but with a very high rate of tax. Tax rates are very high here, so don't think of shifting there. Stay in India, work for India, because India is whatever you are today, you are because of India. So in 1980, various countries signed one agreement called Vienna Convention on Law of Treaty. It has 85 articles. This document is divided into 85 articles. Out of them, our institute has covered, ICAI has covered only 12 articles which we will be discussing. Out of the 12 articles, some of them are very small, some of them are big ones, and some of them are of medium size. One by one we will be discussing. It was signed by 116 countries by January 18. Latest data not available. You can download this entire VCLT of 85 articles. You can download it from some website, treaty.org.in, something name is there, which I have covered in my regular notes. It came into force on 27 January 1980. Ratified, that is approved by 116 countries. How many countries, that institute is not going to ask you, it's just for the sake of your knowledge. Again, an old data, 7-8-year-old data. 85 articles, institute has covered 12 articles. First one is article number, next is the heading, the title of that article, and the principles enumerated, what is talked about it. I have downloaded it entirely for teaching purpose. I studied it entirely, and I found that institute has covered only those articles which are simplest one. Other complicated articles they have not covered only. No need to cover. Our direct tax syllabus itself is so vast that this chapter, there is no need to cover this chapter in the syllabus, but our institute has covered it unnecessarily. In spite of there being a separate course available called International Diploma in International Taxation, institute has covered it. Article 26 is the first article covered here. Pacta sunt servanda. Pacta sunt servanda means in good faith. Treaty is in a good faith. Both the countries should trust each other and should comply with the treaty obligations in good faith. Treaty is binding upon both the parties and must be followed by them in good faith. See, in case there is an agreement between you and me, then it is governed by Indian Contract Act. If you violate, I can complain against you, you can be punished, you can be arrested, or you may have to pay me big compensation. There are legal authorities available to take care of that. If you do not comply, then what can I do? I can do a lot. I can lodge a complaint against you, I can get you arrested. Example, don't take it personally. Then I can take necessary legal actions. But when the treaty is between two countries, one of the country violates the provision, then what will other country do? Technically can't do anything. Therefore, it is clarified that each country should comply with its obligation in good faith, because there is no one to control them. Non-retroactivity. Non-retroactivity would mean non-retrospective effect. No retrospective effect to any particular provision of the treaty unless parties to the contract, parties to the treaty have specifically mentioned that this particular clause or this article shall apply from retrospective date along with the date. No retrospective effect on any part of the treaty except stated otherwise. If the parties intend to give retrospective effect, they will have to clarify it. Territorial scope of the treaty. Territorial scope. It says by default treaty will be applicable when the treaty is between two countries. It applies to each and every part of the given country or the given state. For example, India enters into treaty. By default treaty will apply to each and every part of India, including Jammu Kashmir, including that Pakistan occupied Kashmir, which is the part of India, will apply to that also. However, if India intends to not to apply to that particular part, like the way equalization levy chapter, if you recollect, does not apply to Jammu Kashmir, then we can exclude it. China, if you talk about, China comprises of mainland China, which is only China, then Tibet, Hong Kong and Taiwan. Taiwan says we are a separate country, but China says you are a part of China. So in such situation, if we enter into treaty with China, China will have to clarify whether treaty will apply to only mainland China or the entire China. Entire China, including Hong Kong, Tibet and Taiwan, they call it as PRC, People's Republic of China, not public, People's Republic of China. So treaty shall be binding upon each party in respect of his entire territory unless stated otherwise. Article 31 and 32, they talk about interpretation. So whatever we discuss up till now in the 8 basic rules, same thing is given in Article 31, general rule for interpretation. The general rule means 8 rules, whatever we discuss. Same thing is reproduced in VCLT. Some of you might think, then what is the use of VCLT? Answer, VCLT gives a confirmation that okay, this rule is recognized, this is what is supposed to be done. And those countries which have signed, 116 countries have signed it, for them it will be having a binding effect. Earlier it was in the form of a customary principle which did not have binding effect, but now when it is converted into a proper law, it will have a legal binding force. Ordinary meaning shall be assigned, shall be given to the terms of the treaty in the context and in the light of object and purpose. See, VCLT people have so nicely covered everything in one single line. Our institute took 4 points to explain this point or explain this concept. So, ordinary meaning, liberal meaning of each and every word, having regard to the context, that is contextual interpretation in the light of object and purpose, that is purposive interpretation. Context, where to derive the context, in what context. For example, there is a word called cricket. Cricket has two meaning. One is the game of cricket and the second one is a insect. One insect is also called cricket. Now when there is an agreement between India and ICC, International Cricket Council, and the word cricket is used. Now you want to interpret the word cricket in terms of context. In what context is it used? For what purpose or the what context the treaty between India and ICC is entered into? It is in connection with a game playing game of cricket. So naturally this interpretation. That way there are many words. Like for example bar. What do you mean by bar? The one meaning is chocolate bar. Chocolate bar. Another meaning could be gold bar. It is also a legal term, short form of barrister. We use the word Bar Council of India. Bar also means jail. I'll put you behind the bar. So that is jail, behind the this. Cell, the word cell. Cell is used. One meaning is cell is jail. Jail is also called cell. Second is the battery, mobile cell, mobile battery. Pencil cell, we call it as. Cell means biological cell of the body, of living things or living organisms. Okay, the different meaning possible. Now when the word cell is used, you need to refer to the context in which it is used. Why this word is used and in what context is it used. Where to derive the context from? The answer, context can be derived from the treaty, from the preamble of the treaty, protocol of the treaty. Context shall include its preamble, that is preliminary statement, which is the beginning of the treaty, annexure, that is protocol, which is at the end of the treaty, the text of the treaty, the main treaty itself, and any other agreement or any instrument which was made between all the parties in connection with the conclusion of the treaty. Generally they have MOU, Memorandum of Understanding, Expression of Interest, EOI. So when one country contacts the other country that we are interested in entering into treaty with you for so and so purpose, and in that communication also they describe for what purpose they intend to enter into treaty. So that can also be used for the purpose of deriving the context in which the treaty is used. Apart from the context, the following shall also be taken into account. So when you are interpreting a particular word, give ordinary meaning to each term by having reference to the context in which it is used and in the light of objects and purpose for which it is used. Context can be derived from treaty, MOU, EOI, preamble, protocol, and apart from the context also keep in mind the subsequent agreement between the parties. So 1984 agreement was entered into between India and Mauritius. Later on in 2016 there was a further agreement between India and Mauritius which was attached to the original agreement as a protocol or as an annexure. Subsequent agreement between the parties, subsequent practice in the application of treaty and relevant international rules or international law applicable to it. And it says if special meaning is to be given to a particular term, then parties will have to, if parties so intend, they will have to clarify it in the treaty or somewhere in the protocol that this particular word shall have this meaning. Ideally this does not happen because each and every word is expressed, each and every word is defined in the treaty at the end. Supplementary means of interpretation. So what was Article 31? General rule for interpretation. Now supplementary means can be understood as external aids. It says either in order to confirm the meaning as per Article 31 or to determine the meaning as per Article 31. If the meaning is ambiguous or obscure or leads to an absurd or unreasonable meaning, in order to confirm the meaning as per Article 31, Article 31 is general rule. Whatever meaning is derived, in order to confirm whether that meaning is correct or not. Or if Article 31 is unable to derive the correct meaning, then to derive the correct meaning, Article 32 will be applied. Article 32, parties shall resort to supplementary means of interpretation which includes preparatory work of the treaty and the circumstances of the conclusion. Okay, this generally does not apply in real life, but it says that circumstances of the treaty, in what circumstances treaty was entered into, whether there was any coercive action or not. For example, India, Pakistan, when they entered into treaty, Jawaharlal Nehru, our ex-Prime Minister, signed the treaty. At that time, there was a lot of pressure from United States. US was ally of Pakistan. There was a lot of pressure on India to surrender, or a lot of pressure on India to sign that treaty with Pakistan. So we were compelled to sign. However, now today India does not want to follow that treaty. So in that case, in what context it was used? Apart from context, also refer to circumstances of its conclusion. Under what circumstances treaty was entered into, that will also play an important role. Article 33, interpretation of treaties authenticated in 2 or more languages. I like this article a lot. 2 or more authenticated languages. Normally, treaty would be in one language. If both the countries use the common language, let's say French. So European countries follow French or German or Spanish. However, sometimes two countries speak different language, then the treaty can be entered into in 2 different languages also. In that case, originally the treaty is in one language, then it is called as treaty is authenticated in one language. Originally the treaty is in 2 languages, then it is called treaty is authenticated in 2 languages. However, initially treaty was in 2 languages. Later on, if they want to come out with a treaty in another version, another language, when a treaty is authenticated in 2 or more languages, the text of both of them is equally authoritative in each language, unless they have decided from the beginning that the meaning assigned in a particular language will supersede the meaning in another language. Unless it is stated in a treaty that in case of differences or in case of disputes, the text of one language shall prevail over the other one. In case that is clarified, then that particular language, treaty in that language will supersede. Otherwise, treaty in both the languages which are originally authenticated will have equal authority. However, in case they wish to enter into treaty with another language, come out with another version, say India and let's say Indonesia, we have entered into agreement is in their Indonesian language plus in, or let's say Malaysia, India and Malaysia, originally it is in English and Malaysian language. Now supposingly tomorrow it is found that most of the people going from India to Malaysia and are subjected to treaty are those people who speak Malayalam. Then for the sake of benefiting those people from India, those who speak Malayalam, it is decided to come out with another version. Originally it is in Malaysian language, local language of Malaysia, English, and now India intends to come out with another version. Then what to do? Then that language, treaty version in Malayalam, can also be treated as an authenticated language if the parties intend to do so. Both the parties should agree that okay, third version in Malayalam is also authenticated language. Version of treaty in another language other than the one in which it was originally authenticated shall also be considered as an authentic text, but only if it was provided in the treaty or the parties to the treaty have agreed upon it. Later on they can agree. Terms of the treaty are presumed to have the same meaning in each authenticate language. So if there is a difference in the meaning between the text of the treaty and two different authenticated languages, in Hindi there is a different meaning and in English there is another meaning, then Article 31 and 32 do not remove such differences, then the meaning which best reconciles the text of the treaty having regard to the object and purpose of the treaty shall be adopted. That meaning shall be assigned which reconciles to the object and purpose of the treaty, unless it was clarified in the treaty that text of one language is going to prevail over the other language as per first para. Article 34, general rule regarding third state. Third state, for example, treaties between India and Pakistan, and third state is China. So it says treaty between India and Pakistan cannot create any rights for the third party China, nor can it create any obligation for the third party China, except with the approval of China. So if India wants China also to be a part of this agreement, then instead of having a bilateral agreement, they will have to enter into tripartite agreement by including China also as one of the signatories. Treaties between two states does not create any obligation, nor does it create any right of a third party without its consent, but if they wish to, they can include China in the treaty and they can have a tripartite agreement. For example, there is this Indus river, this is China, this is Pakistan, and this is India. This is India, for example. This is India, China, India, Pakistan. So there is one river which is known by different name in different countries. It flows from China. It flows from China, comes to India, and then from India it goes to Pakistan. It comes from China, comes to India, then it goes to Pakistan. So in such situation, if there is agreement between only India, Pakistan about sharing the water of that river, which can be controlled by China by constructing a dam over it, then in such situation India may not be able to fulfill its commitment to Pakistan except when China cooperates. So in such situation they can have a tripartite agreement. With Jawaharlal Nehru made a mistake, our ex-Prime Minister, he entered into treaty with Pakistan without involving China. So we sometimes find ourselves little helpless for these mistakes committed in the history. Okay. So it does not create any obligation for China as of today because of treaty restricted to India and Pakistan. Next is validity and continuance in force of the treaty. Now in force means from what date to what date the treaty is applicable, that is called continuity in force. It says if any party to the treaty wants to withdraw itself, does not want to give consent to the validity, after entering into treaty some party wants to withdraw. Like for example, there was a treaty between various countries, ideally G20 countries at Paris called Climate Change Treaty. In that treaty, US under presidency of Donald Trump, they wanted to withdraw themselves. So answer, this can be done. The participation or the consent to the treaty can be withdrawn. After giving consent, one can withdraw, provided it is done subject to procedure given in the treaty, subject to application of treaty. The validity of a treaty or the validity of the consent of a particular state to be bound by the treaty may be called into question, may be challenged. Simply that party can withdraw, but only through the application of the treaty or convention. Like climate change policy has a limitation that anybody wants to withdraw will have to wait for 1 year. Today you apply to the committee and then you can withdraw yourself actually only after 1 year from the date of intimating your intention. Same thing Brexit, when Britain exited from European Union, at that time it had to give warning, and then there was a waiting period of 2 years as per agreement between them. Britain had to wait for 2 years, government got changed in between. As per that treaty between all European countries, Britain will be given an option to reconsider its decision, and there is some procedure. So as per that procedure, then only it can be done. Similarly, termination of a treaty or withdrawal of a party from the treaty may take place only through the application of treaty or convention. Same rule shall apply for suspension of treaty. Meaning thereby suspension, withdrawal, cancellation of treaty, everything will be as per procedure given in the treaty. 60th, 60, 61 and 62, last three, 4. Here 60, 61 and 62 article number, all three go hand in hand. They all three talk about withdrawal from the treaty. How one party can terminate itself or terminate the treaty on its part, how it can be done. So different reasons are given for what purpose, for what reasons treaty can be terminated. There is a termination of the treaty, and in sometimes termination is not required, then only suspension of the treaty, of the operation of the treaty as a consequence of a breach. Here reason for terminating is breach. Breach as in one party, the other party has breached some major condition. The other party has breached the condition to the treaty, then the first mentioned party can terminate the treaty on its own unilaterally without signature, without permission of the other party. For example, there is a treaty between India and Pakistan. Pakistan has breached some provision, India can terminate the treaty. This VCLT is applicable not only on tax treaties, I already told you it is applicable on other treaties also. So India can terminate the treaty unilaterally on its own by making announcement, no more applicable, provided Pakistan has breached something. A material breach of bilateral treaty, a material breach should be material. If it is very negligible, like Pakistan refuses to hand over some terrorists to India with reasoning that according to Pakistan's law that person is not a terrorist, then in such situation India cannot treat it as a breach by Pakistan. Material breach of a bilateral treaty by one of the parties entitles the other party to invoke breach as a ground, as a reason for terminating the treaty or for suspending the operation of the treaty either in whole or in part that is okay. This can be done by other parties by unanimous agreement, unilateral agreement, without signature, without consent of the breaching party. However, provisions of treaty which are applicable in the event of breach shall be kept in mind. Next is another reason. One was breach. Treaty can be terminated for number A, breach. Number B, can be terminated because of supervening. Supervening means interrupting or intervening, impossibility of performance. Impossibility of performance maybe because of some event, like for example, number of years back there was some football tournament, World Cup, FIFA agreement was there between FIFA, Federation of International Football Association, or whatever is the name. I am not very much into sports, so don't expect me to be. FIFA had entered into an agreement with some country, let's say Brazil. I don't recollect the name of that country, but for example Brazil. Brazil was to send its players. Brazil sent an aircraft with 20 players, some extra players also. Best 20 players were sent. As per agreement between FIFA and Brazil, if Brazil does not send its players, Brazil will have to pay some penalty which can go up to some 20 crore Indian rupees. That much penalty Brazil had to pay. 20 players, aircraft carrying 20 players was sent. Due to terror attack on that aircraft, all the 20 players died. Or maybe there was a crash, plane crash, or maybe due to natural calamity or due to some engine failure or technical issue, or for any reason all 20 players died. So this treaty, complying with the obligation of treaty, becomes an impossible thing. There is an impossibility of performance on the part of Brazil. Can Brazil terminate the treaty, or can it withdraw itself from the treaty of 12 countries? Answer, yes. This is intervening impossibility of performance. Giving this, citing this as a reason or as a ground, Brazil can withdraw itself. So a party may invoke impossibility of performing a provision of a treaty as a ground for terminating the treaty or withdrawing from it. The treaty is not terminated, you people, remaining countries continue, we are withdrawing from it. If the impossibility results from the permanent disappearance or destruction of an object, if the impossibility is because of permanent disappearance or permanent destruction of an object which is absolutely necessary for execution of the treaty. Here what has permanently disappeared? Answer, 20 players, without which they can't play the tournament, they can't comply with the treaty. If the impossibility is temporary, if it is temporary, then this can be invoked as a ground for suspending the treaty instead of permanently terminating it. Impossibility of performance may not be invoked as a ground by that party as a ground for termination if the impossibility is a result of breach by that party. So if Pakistan has breached some treaty, maybe treaty with India or maybe some other international obligation, Pakistan is a breaching party, then India can terminate. Pakistan cannot terminate it by calling it as impossibility of performance. By citing impossibility of performance as a reason, Pakistan cannot terminate it. Either of the obligation, if there is a breach by that party of either of an obligation under the India-Pakistan treaty or of any international obligation owed to any third party. So now this, what happens is, this is interesting, keep it in your mind. Since there is no authority to take legal action against the breaching party, if you and me enter into agreement and you breach something, then I can lodge a police complaint, I can go to the court, get you arrested and compel you to comply with the treaty obligation, or I can ask you to pay compensation. However, when there is a breach by Pakistan, then what will India do? So answer, other countries will support. If one country breaches its obligation under the treaty, then India can terminate. And not only that, if there is a breach of any international obligation owed to that other party, then if owed to India, then other country can also terminate its treaty with Pakistan. So Pakistan will face lot of legal consequences if they breach any provision with India. That is how a compulsion is created amongst the countries to comply with the obligation of the treaty. Same way, if India does not comply with that particular treaty, then say India has entered into some treaty with United Nations for non-proliferation of nuclear weapons, NTBT. So in such situation, if India breaches it tomorrow, then not only that treaty is breached by India, that is okay, but then other countries will terminate its other treaties with India. So if Canada has entered into treaty with India whereby Canada is going to supply uranium, Canada will stop. Canada will terminate that treaty and we can't do anything. If some other country has agreed to supply natural gas to us, that country will also terminate its treaty and then we will be helpless. Now next is fundamental change of circumstances. This can be also used for terminating treaty. Breach was the first, second is impossibility of performance, third is a fundamental change of circumstance. Circumstances which were prevailing at the time of entering into treaty have changed now, because of which treaty needs to be terminated or one party needs to suspend the treaty or it needs to withdraw itself from the treaty. Ideally people use this as a ground for terminating treaty, like the way United States, Donald Trump became president, so they withdrew USA from that climate change treaty, citing that there is a fundamental change. Our government does not advocate entering into such kind of treaty. It is financially hazardous for USA to enter into such treaty. So if fundamental change of circumstances has occurred as compared to those circumstances existing at the time of concluding the treaty, which was not foreseen by any of the parties or may not, then it may not be invoked as a ground for terminating or withdrawing from the treaty unless, may not be used as a ground unless existence of those circumstances formed an essential basis for consent of the parties to be bound by the treaty. Unless the existence of those circumstances which have got changed now, existence of those circumstances formed a basis for the consent given by that party. So if USA has given consent under the leadership of Joe Biden, and that is, those were the circumstances, and existing of those circumstances are the primary condition for giving consent. That means if Joe Biden government does not continue, government gets changed, then the validity of the treaty will be reviewed by the new government, then in that case US can withdraw itself. Or the effect of change is such that it drastically changes the extent of obligations which are yet to be performed by another treaty or yet to be performed under the treaty. For example, there is a treaty between India and USA that we will supply particular product in so much quantity. That product we import from Iran. We import from Iran, say crude oil or the natural gas, we import from Iran, we refine it and then we export it to USA. India and USA, we have agreement that we will supply particular quantity of crude oil or maybe particular quantity of petroleum oil after refining it. But we are no more able to supply to USA if Iran stops supplying to us. If Iran stops supplying raw material, that is crude oil to us. It's an example. Or maybe there is a natural calamity, Iran gets destructed, or entire Iran is attacked by some other country, Israel attacks Iran and Iran is destroyed. Then in such situation, Iran will not be able to supply to us as per committed quantity. We will not be able to supply to USA. That can be called as a fundamental change of circumstances. We can terminate our treaty with USA without facing any legal consequences. A fundamental change of circumstances may not be invoked as a ground for terminating or withdrawing if the treaty establishes boundary. So if treaty establishes a boundary, that means consequences are mentioned in a treaty that so and so happens. So India already mentioned in the treaty with USA that we will supply only after receiving so much quantity from Iran. So there is a boundary. If there is a clarification in the treaty, there is a boundary, there is a clause in the treaty that okay, if Iran stops, the raw material doesn't come from Iran, then purchase raw material from another country and supply to US anyhow. Then purchase at expensive rate from let's say Saudi Arabia, purchase at double rate from Saudi Arabia. Even though it costs double, purchase from it, US will compensate us, US will pay us double. If that kind of boundary is established, then even if raw material stops coming from Iran, the Indo-US treaty will not or cannot be terminated for so and so reason, for fundamental change of circumstance. Or in case if the fundamental change is a result of breach by that party of the obligation under the treaty or any other international obligation owed to any other party. So there is an agreement between India, Pakistan, and Pakistan raises this as a ground. There is a fundamental change of circumstances. Pakistan will not be able to supply natural gas which is coming from Iran if there is a breach by Pakistan. If Pakistan has breached his agreement with Iran, then Pakistan cannot terminate treaty with India. Pakistan has to comply with his obligation anyhow. And fundamental change of circumstances may be invoked not only for terminating the treaty or withdrawal of treaty, but also for suspension of the treaty if it is temporary in nature. And 64th is my favorite, but warn you, up till now our institute has not asked a single question on Vclt, Vienna Convention on Law of Treaty. This new chapter was introduced from May 18 attempt and onwards. May 18 attempt and onwards, that was the first attempt, and now today it's been like 7-8 years. Up till now institute has not asked any question on this Vclt in the last 7 years, in the last 14 attempts. So you can decide the importance on your own. Otherwise questions are mainly focused upon 8 basic principles and 6 extrinsic rules. Okay, now 64th and the last article, then this chapter will be over. Emergence of a new peremptory norm. Emergence means rising of, coming into existence of a new peremptory norm of general interpretation, general international law. Peremptory norm. What is peremptory? Peremptory means binding, legally binding, having a binding effect. It says if any new peremptory, that is binding, final, conclusive norm of general international law emerges, then existing treaty which is in conflict with that norm. A new law has come internationally and the existing treaty is not in accordance with that norm or is conflicting with this norm, contradicting with that new norm, then treaty shall automatically become terminated, shall automatically stand terminated. For example, treaty is there between India and let's say UAE, that India will supply plastic bags, particular huge quantity of plastic bags of less than 20 microns. Plastic bags of less than 20 microns, very thin polythene bags it is called as, polythene plastic bags. Now this particular item is banned as per new international law, this item only is banned. So India cannot manufacture any further, but India has a 5-year agreement with UAE that India will supply. So there is an emergence of new peremptory norm of international law, because of which India, this treaty itself will get terminated automatically. India cannot supply just because India has an agreement. Same way in India there is something which is narcotic drug. In India it is considered as a narcotic drug, marijuana, which is allowed in USA, officially allowed. It can be sold openly and can be consumed also openly, but in India it is banned as a narcotic drug. But supposing India is into growing of that drug, India is very good in growing. India, Afghanistan, our land and our climate supports all these products. So India is growing it and India has an agreement to supply to USA marijuana, or filtered marijuana, rich quality marijuana, which some ministers also consume, hypothetically. So in such situation, tomorrow there is a ban on this product, marijuana, it is banned only. Then in such situation, the treaty between India and USA will automatically get terminated, right? That is what it talks about. However, up till now questions haven't come on this Vclt, as I told you. That's it. With that, revision of this chapter called Overview of Tax Treaties, Application and Interpretation comes to an end. Wish you all a very good luck, all the best. See you in the next video with some other chapter.